I started my lab 2 years ago at the Neuroscience Institute at NYU, and what a fantastic voyage it has been these last 2 years. And these are the shining stars who light up our lab. And where did this journey begin? I grew up in Calcutta, India, and this is the house I grew up in, 8 by 1 by 1 Loudon Street. It's etched in my memory for life. And every time I go back there, these memories come streaming in. Memories of my father reading his morning paper on the veranda. My father, who'd once done the first kidney transplant in Calcutta and now has a hard time remembering what he ate for breakfast. Memories of our first kiss on that veranda, and then years later, our wedding celebrations there. And more recently, memories of our son Ari's rice eating ceremony. Ari, he's almost 2, and it's fascinating to see him learn at the speed of lightning. He's making all these associations between people, places, objects, events. He's forming his episodic memories. And that's what I'm interested in as a neuroscientist. I want to know how these episodic memories are formed from our sensory experiences. As we navigate this world, we're exposed to all these sensory stimuli. What we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, has to be combined in time and space into one coherent memory. And so deep-seated is this memory, it can also almost last us a lifetime, right? And these are coherent memories because even the hint of that sensory experience can conjure instantaneous recall. And so powerful is that memory. It can help us change our behavior, adapt our future actions based on the situation. So we asked other neuroscientists, why are they in the brain business?
Because I'm interested in my own brain. This is probably the most exciting thing to know about ourselves.
Fascinating, and I want to understand my wife.
I started out in philosophy and psychology, and I realized that neuroscience really rests at this interesting juncture.
Potentially everything is at least a little bit related to neuroscience. It's the lens in which we understand the world.
How everything, why we feel what we feel, why we do what we do.
How memories shape current experiences and future actions.
In order to find treatments for such diseases as Alzheimer's and post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what drives behavior and maybe ultimately your personality.
How brain filters differently the same upcoming input, but interprets it differently.
How we think, what we dream.
Narcissistic organ wants to understand itself.
So I think the stigmas that exist against mental health are there because of our gap in knowledge.
It's the coolest science to study, so.
Because I believe this is what makes us fundamentally human.
It's the only way to understand, treat, and eventually cure psychiatric disease. So the brain is the mysterious challenge.
The nervous system are the subject of natural laws, and I would like to understand these laws one day.
Because it's the most important organ.
The brain is one of the most complicated things that's been made by evolution.
It's because there are so many unknowns.
Neuroscience is who we are.
Yes, neuroscience is who we are. This is what makes us human. And bold dreams, that's what we have. But only 10% of those students and postdocs who will dedicate almost more than a decade to studying neuroscience will make their way into the faculty level in academia. Academia, an environment that promotes freedom of thought, promotes collaboration. It pushes us to take risks, challenge existing paradigms. And passionate as they may be, not all our dreams will be supported. we rely on your taxpayer funding to support our research. And we'd like to solve problems, the diseases of the mind. But we're very far from it. It troubles me, even as a neuroscientist. I can't help alleviate the suffering of my daddy's dementia symptoms. I can't explain to my mom, who's given up her dreams, who's his primary caregiver, why is he having these memory losses? A brilliant professor and physician that we know. You know, if I bring in figures of Alzheimer's disease, they're very grave. And I know Nasreen has a personal connection with Alzheimer's here. 5 million people in the US suffer from Alzheimer's today. Now that's only going to increase to 13 million in 2050. 700,000 people died last year of Alzheimer's. And it's going to cost us more than $500 billion to support the healthcare of these patients. So the National Institutes of Health brought up this goal that by 2025, maybe we can dream of curing or preventing, understanding Alzheimer's. We need to raise $300 million for it. What happens in Alzheimer's? Neurons die. We lose our memories. Neurons are the building blocks of the brain. They connect with each other to form circuits. Wow! So he just said, wow. But he's fast asleep over there at the back. And there are two kinds of neurons primarily in the brain, although there are actually hundreds of kinds, but two very important kinds. And they talk to each other through electrical signals and chemical signals. So you can think of neurons that cause excitation as being like the go signal. They'll allow information to propagate forward. Then you also need a stop signal. And these are the inhibitory neurons. And they'll block excitation from falling through. And excitation and inhibition coexist in harmony, creating a balance. They create an order in the brain. Right? So imagine if you didn't have any stop signals. Utter chaos. Crash, 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 crash. So we did an experiment in the lab. We imaged brain activity when inhibition was intact. You can see the order, the symmetry, the synchrony of the neurons firing back and forth. Then we said, what happens if we take away inhibition? Let's block inhibition with a drug. And that's what starts happening. Look at the utter chaos. And can you imagine? That is what happens when a patient of epilepsy suffers a seizure. And you can only imagine what happens to the memories that are stored in that region of the brain. So, you know, when I was a kid and I used to go to school, I used to walk to school. I was pretty, we lived pretty close to my school. And in the mornings, I would take this particular route. I walked down Loudon Street because there was this really nice bakery, and the whiff of baked goods, it was enticing. I'd pick up a treat on my way. But on the way back, I would take a slightly longer route to catch a glimpse of the fountains in Minto Park kick off, And this is just an example of how my behavior was being shaped by motivation. And sometimes they'd also be shaped by punishment. So we asked, how do we study this, right? And how does space, time, context merge together as one experience and shape our memories? So there is this area of the brain, the hippocampus. It looks like the seahorse, and that's why it's called the hippocampus in Greek. So if you look at it, I'll trace it out, it looks like this, right? Like a seahorse. And it receives all these sensory inputs from the multisensory cortex next to it, takes that, processes it, stores it as memories. That's my rendition of the hippocampus here. And other than the seahorse, an enchanting sea creature, it's also the jellyfish that neuroscience owes a lot to. The jellyfish helped us see inside the brain. So we can take fluorescent proteins from the jellyfish and put it in the brains of mammals and then see neurons light up. And we were able to use this to trace the connections between this multisensory cortex and the hippocampus. You can see in green those processes in neurons talking from the multisensory cortex to the hippocampus. You can even put different colors in different neurons. And you can record from them, talk to them with electrical recordings. And this helped us map a new circuit. This was a new circuit which made the multisensory cortex inhibit the hippocampus. And we asked, can it filter information this way? So we decided to image the activity of those inputs from the multisensory cortex to the hippocampus during rewards. Remember the whiff of baked goods? So here we imaged when water rewards were given. And you can see every time the water is given, those neurons light up. In red, you'll see the neurons pop up. Do you see it? Not when there's running, not when there's licking out of turn, only when the water reward comes. Also happens when you have aversive stimuli come on. So we asked, what happens when we silence the circuit? Imagine having a really unpleasant experience or sensing danger, a fire truck in action. What would be your response? Run as fast as you can. But put that fire truck in a very different context. For example, Ari's fire truck in the woods. It shouldn't conjure the same emotions, right? Your brain would output two very different outputs for these two images, right? This is a picture of Empire State Building I took on my way home. You can see, it's a partial view, but you can still see that it's the Empire State Building. This is one I took from the Washington Square. So far away, almost hidden, is the Empire State Building. These are two different images, but your brain is telling you, it's the same thing. Let's complete the pattern, let's generalize it, and call it only Empire State Building. So pattern separation, pattern completion. So in neuroscience nerd terms, what happens is if you have input, so let's look at that input pattern. That's not a crossword puzzle. That's the input pattern for, say, the Empire State Building. And that's the neuron output. So neurons that will fire when you see the Empire State Building. You see the other angle from Washington Square, and you see the input pattern is different, but there's still some similarity, right? There are two of those neurons are exactly the same. So the brain will say, I'm going to produce the same output. Now let's think of fire truck in action producing this output, and toy fire truck. Very different input. So it should render a very different output. We silence that circuit, and this context, an aversive context, and a safe context produced the behavior that would be only for this fear context. So they overgeneralized their fear. They couldn't discriminate between aversive or safe environments. That's exactly what happens in PTSD. A loud pop in New York is not the same as a loud bang in Iraq. But in patients of PTSD, it conjures the same emotional response, the same physical and emotional suffering. Dr. Duval, in The Fantastic Voyage, the science fiction movie, said, all the suns that light the corridors of the universe shine dim before the blazing of a single thought. And the next few years in the Basu lab, we are dreaming of imaging activity of the brain to see the blazing of a single thought.